Welcome to Words on Words, a podcast sponsored by the University of Nevada, Reno Writing Center. Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Words on Words. I'm your host, Iris. I'm a master's student in the English program here at UNR. I'm joined today by Reese and Aaron for our exciting episode. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm Erin. I'm a PhD student in rhetoric and composition, and I study disposition and academic literacy development.
Cool.
Hi, my name's Reese. I'm a grad student in political science with an emphasis in electoral politics. And that is it. Yep.
Cool. Today we'll be discussing the misuse of real words and the use of fake words. So we're looking at things like irregardless, intensive purposes, or using ironic for things that actually are not ironic by definition. So let's start out with examples that we see all the time in either social media or in student papers or ourselves have fallen into.
Literally.
Let us start with literally. Let us start.
So I think this is a recent thing, I feel. The last few years I've heard it much more than before, but people using the word literally in conversation to emphasize something.
Mm-hmm.
But, for example, I literally died laughing. That is not,
The correct form.
Right. That is not how literally actually is used.
How is it actually meant to be used, if you want to explain for those that just
How do we literally use literally?
How do you literally use literally? Literally. So it means in reality.
Right,
In
actually, yes.
Right.
So if you said I literally died, you couldn't say I literally died laughing because you would be dead. Yes.
Your ghost has come back and is...
Or if, what are some other examples? I saw one the other day about literally. That didn't have to do with death.
Sorry.
But, well, I mean, it could be, there was a literal hurricane outside when it was not an actual hurricane, or it's literally prison in school. It's not actually prison. So we're finding now that literally is making that change into more so meaning figuratively, which would happen, and as emphasis.
Yeah, I was going to say it's used as to emphasize as a modifier for whatever people are describing.
Reese, do you have any examples of words being used?
Well, I think a lot of it is people tend to overemphasize with things like irregardless or I couldn't care less.
Oh, yeah.
They often forget that the less is meant to act as something to emphasize the word itself. So for irregardless, regardless works on its own.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need the ear there, right?
And that might be people not knowing really what parts of words do things, or they don't actually know what regardless means, that there's regard, and then there's a less on it to make it not regarded.
Right, yeah.
And then ear would do the same thing, so you think of irresponsible. So you don't really say responsible-less.
Yeah.
That'd be a weird way to phrase that, but I think they might be trying to take what they do with irresponsible, because that seems something possibly more used in daily language than regardless. So they're trying to put that kind of suffix of language onto that word that doesn't take it.
Yeah.
And that goes to trying to sound smart or trying to use words that...
Highfalutin language.
Highfalutin language.
I think the example of couldn't care less, though, I think it's just an idiom that people use and don't really think about what the words mean.
When people say I could care less, I was like, well, you're saying that you have an amount of caring for a thing that is not the least amount of caring, right?
Exactly. So there's still a part of you that still cares if you say I could care less.
If there's a baseline of the amount that you couldn't care, you're over that.
But that's the point of I couldn't care. So I mean, I don't know if people are using the idiom wrong or not quite thinking about it like we were talking about. But it's that you don't care is what I couldn't care less is supposed to show. Because if you can't care less, there's no less cares
to have.
Yeah.
But if you say I could care less, then it implies that you care a little bit to begin with.
Exactly.
But that one gets misused often, I think.
Quite often. What do we have? Intensive purposes. I think that's another one where people might not know what it's meant to mean. And so you kind of hear it funny, or you don't see it written down ever. It's just people are saying, for all intents and purposes, and the way someone says it or the way you hear it changes it to intensive instead of intense and purposes.
That was one that I don't think I knew which version of it was right or wrong until I saw them written. It was like within the same span, like 5 minutes, I saw it written twice by two different people in both ways. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh, wait a second. And I had to go look it up to see which one was right, because I didn't actually know. It's also not a phrase I use really myself. I don't think, but yeah, I saw it in a couple of papers back to back, and that was when I was like, oh, I didn't even know that
there was any discrepancy.
I'm not sure that I knew which way was right until I saw it written.
Down. Interesting. And that can, we can talk about ways that we've seen these words be used incorrectly, or how we figured out how to use them correctly. I know I had to look up and kind of make up my own thing for fewer and less. So I always say less milk, fewer cows, for less as a whole that you're not really counting, and fewer for things that you can count. So the cows that you have, you can count the cows. There's not like a nebulous cow that you cannot piece apart. So I had to look that up though, and it never really bothered me, I guess, until other people started correcting everybody else online, where it's like, that's not the correct use of less. I'm like,
excuse me, ma'am.
Is there a thing here? So I mean, that's one that I've seen that I looked up my own kind of fix for it, so I can remember how that works.
Well, and there's a certain degree of like, do we allow people to use words incorrectly, like in colloquial, like friendly talk with one another, or do we correct them even then to essentially be like, well, you're misusing it, sir, in the social, like in a coffee shop somewhere, right? Like that. Like there's the whole idea of good versus well, right? Where people, like, I learned it from 30 Rock, incidentally, where I think it was Liz Lemon, she corrected someone and said, it was Kenneth. He said, Superman does good, you do well. Which was like, I don't want to be that jerk that comes up to someone either in the workplace or like in a social event, was like, excuse me, sir, like you were doing this wrong.
Is that what people do? Yeah. Have you gone to have you gone to like Starbucks and you're talking to somebody and you use good and well incorrectly, and your neighbor taps on your shoulder? Oh no, has this happened?
No.
Okay.
No. I'm just picturing it, and like,
it sounds
terrible. Who does that?
I don't know.
I mean, like
the thing,
I think it's just an internet thing.
Yeah. Because you could be anonymous and you could be the jerk that says, hey buddy.
Hey, correcting people does not make someone a jerk. You are just trying to improve the consistency
just
of the
how
language.
diplomatic.
I wonder if we're more likely to correct others in either, I'm thinking online, like Twitter or Facebook posts, or even via text, than we are in speaking conversation. Mm-hmm. Like once it's written down, does that make it more acceptable to correct when people use literally in the wrong place? Or I don't know, I don't do it there either.
Yeah, I think
so.
I think if it's something obvious, so if it's a good or well, where it's not a matter of hearing somebody incorrectly, that's something that might be corrected in writing and in speech. But if we have the intensive purposes thing, or if people say instead of, or no, what was I thinking of? Like must have instead of must of.
Oh, yeah.
So you'll see that written, but that's not something you'll really be able to pick out in speech.
Because they sound so similar.
Right. Because a lot of people, they'll just contract it to must of, and people think that's must of instead of must apostrophe V-E. Mm-hmm. So I think that's something where it's easier to correct because it's written and it's set in stone in that case, and you can see, oh, you don't know how this works.
Right.
And then you correct them that way. That's also another one that bothers me, when people use of instead of have. when it should be used there.
I have the same thing with then and than.
Oh, yeah.
Which is also, you can't hear it necessarily in people's speech, but when it's written, it's really obvious that it's the wrong version.
Right. I don't know. I think that might be a linguistic dialect, whether you pronounce it as than or if you pronounce it as
That's what I was just thinking.
Yeah.
My family from the East Coast, you can probably tell which is which when they're talking, but not us.
Yeah. I wonder, this might be a study, but I wonder if people can take those geographic differences and study which ones use then and than incorrectly.
Oh.
So if there's that sound difference in like Bostonian dialect, are like those students
more likely to write it?
Right. Are those students more likely to use the correct then and then than those where it's actually the same sound? Just things to think about.
Yeah. That's a good question. That's really interesting. No, but kind of related to that, the thinking about what we find acceptable to use in like social media or texting, and then what shows up in papers, student papers that we see around here. We were talking yesterday about text speak that shows up and like words that get shortened. We were talking legit. Legit was one of the ones that we, which is short for legitimate, right? And I feel like, I think there are some people who don't know that legit is not a real word on its own, and we use it in. I've heard reporters use it on TV, and so when official figures are using that kind of slang, there's something about
it legitimizes.
Yes,
that was unintentional, but
when a news anchor uses the word legit, it legitimizes the word legit.
Yes. Yes. It legitimately legitimizes legit.
Literally.
Sorry. Reese had one that we discussed about condone and condemn, and how those sound similar and they were used incorrectly in your...
So I was in I was in one of my classes, and we were actually reading our papers aloud to our professor, just as kind of a measure of what could you improve, and so on and so forth. But we eventually got to my misuse of a word that my professor called me out for, which made me all the better of a more accurate of a writer, of like, well, you're using condone to mean condemn, when condemn means to, like, you're forbidding, or you're not necessarily forbidding something, but you're saying that something is
bad.
Yeah, it's bad, right? Like you're condemning something to prison, or what have you.
So you would say one is condemned to hell, not one is condoned.
Right, which in that case, condone would be like you're going to permit that to happen, right? Is in the case of condones usage, like we do not condone this action, which is to say we do condemn it. But I came away from it with instead of like digging my heels in deeper for something like that, I was like, oh well, I'm probably misusing a lot more words than I had thought previously, I guess. A lot of people interchange words without necessarily like being corrected on it, and I think that does them a disservice, especially if they're like going through higher education and like they misuse that word for the entirety of their time writing papers from freshman to senior year. So I think that's important to at least be like kind in calling one another out and being like, hey, like you're misusing this word, but here's the correct way to do it, instead of like, buddy, you're
hey pal,
jerk. Yeah.
We call it thesaurus syndrome sometimes, when it goes back to that idea of trying to sound smart and using quote-unquote academic language by doing the right-click in word and just picking whatever the thesaurus recommends without looking up what that word is. Yeah. I feel like I see that a lot in student papers where students are, like I said, concerned with wanting to sound intelligent and thinking that bigger words is the way to do it. And they end up using words, and then if no one points it out to them, they will use that word incorrectly forever.
So we've talked a little bit, or at least mentioned a couple times, how you're trying to sound smart, and that's sometimes how we end up using these words incorrectly. What impression, we've kind of touched on it, but what impression do you think these kinds of incorrect usages give, or why does this matter? So in college, it probably matters for your grade, but when you get into the real world, where's this going to matter if you don't have any kind of professional role, or all your friends use legit, and and they're fine with that. So I mean, I personally, but it almost decredits a writer. Is that a word, decredit? Hey. The writer loses their credibility for me if I see that they're using then and then incorrectly. If I see that irregardless has been used, if it's obvious they've used the thesaurus and not looked up what the actual word should be. Do you guys get the same kind of feeling about that, or does it not bother you as much, or what kind of impressions do you get?
I think me personally, it doesn't bother me, but I understand that other people often see it as like a lack of education or stupidity or something along those lines. I mean, to me, it's just about exposure to the language. And if no one has corrected them before, and they may not know, I tutored a high school student once who had the word capiche in this. It was a story that she had written, but she spelled it Kapeesh. She had heard the word capiche. She knew what it meant. So she was using it right, but had no idea that it was not English and didn't know how to spell it. So she spelled it the way it sounded. And when I told her, I was like, no, it's Italian, and this is how you actually spell it. And if you're going to use a foreign word, you're supposed to italicize, like, the whole thing. And she was like, completely, she had no idea. She was 14. How would she know that? She hears it from, like, on TV or whatever, or from friends or her parents or something. So I don't necessarily think that using language incorrectly is actually a sign of intelligence or not intelligence, a lack of intelligence. But I do think it says something about, often, just about exposure and what you've seen when you hear it versus having seen it written down. But I think other people make assumptions about intelligence when you use language incorrectly.
And I think it might still be an issue in a business setting, like I'm thinking of on cover letters or resumes.
Right.
If you're using...
Literally?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
If you use, I literally saved the company $10,000, then, I mean, maybe it might not go over so well with the folks at the folks at HR. But things like that. So, I mean, it may not bother, like, an individual person.
Right.
But I think it may be detrimental for, getting a job, for seeking higher education. If you have, like, an application form for a scholarship and you have a bunch of words that don't exist in your application, that's probably not going to sit well with the admissions committee. So I think that might be, I mean, that should hypothetically encourage people to look more into their language and what they're using, but I don't know if it will.
Getting feedback on things before submitting that
what
job application.
What the Writing Center is for.
Shameless plug.
Right.
We are here for that. I mean, you don't even have to know if you're using something incorrectly. Come on in. We'll try and read it. We'll be like, hey, let's not use must of in this sentence.
Well, and usually it shows, like, I think that misuse of language shows on the part of the writer at least somewhat good intentions in trying to utilize that thing correctly, like in even utilizing it to begin with. Like, they're showing that they want to branch out in terms of, like, the extent to which they're using that language, right? Like, if they're and I think that if they aren't completely isolated as an author and hopefully branch out and, like, get in the input of writers who maybe know how to utilize that bit of language in a more effective way or in a proper way, then they could possibly improve their prospects of getting a job and things along those lines. And so a lot of it is they mean well, but it's often they probably want to endear themselves to their audience if they're using legit in a cover letter, but need to know that, like,
if they're thinking about it in that way.
If they're thinking about it, right?
I think that's the. I think there's something also about understanding. Like, I use legit when I'm talking. I know that it's not a real word, but I use it all the time when I'm talking with my friends. But I know to write out legitimate if I am writing it. If I need to come across as professional, that being able, you mentioned discourse communities earlier, being able to like differentiate between what language is appropriate in what context and with different communities.
Right.
And using slang when you're talking with your friends is fine. Using slang in that cover letter is probably not fine unless you're applying for a job where it's appropriate to use slang.
And that's where maybe the role of social media or even Reddit or other kind of group communities on the internet may or may not serve to fix or encourage these kind of misuses. So in one social circle on Facebook, you might use legit or irregardless or must of and not be corrected. Or either no one takes the time to, or no one knows the difference.
Or it's not considered incorrect in that context.
Or it's not considered incorrect for that social group or for that discourse community. Whereas you go to a larger group of people and you're going to have everybody with their asterisks fixing your there, and theirs, or people with their its and its, and people correcting you on all of those things, usually without an explanation as to why it should be
right.
one way versus the other. So do you think that social media plays a role in how words are used or providing that exposure to correct or incorrect usages or spellings?
Well, I think it does. So there are two effects that social media can have on these sorts of, on how we use words, whether it's incorrectly or correctly. One of this is that we tend to, when we make our social media accounts, we tend to self-sort ourselves. That's totally redundant.
Sorry.
That's an example.
Regardless, we tend to group together as with like-minded people, and as such, we can kind of create our own echo chambers of thought and action, right? So when we're together if we come from California and we use legit, we're likely to use it with other people who are our friends. And as a result, we reinforce one another's own usage of language by in the colloquial kind of like comment section of one another's posts, we tend to just say, oh, well, that was a legit something or other. That was a legit video, or oh, your this new thing that you just accomplished was totally legit. Like all of those things tend to reinforce one another. And I think to a certain extent, the second effect that can happen with having a social media account is that that just means that you need to branch out more in terms of the number of people that you befriend. So if you befriend more people who may be members of a local, like, I don't know, poetry club on campus or something along those lines, right? They may have
taken that very seriously.
well, right. Like, the thing is like you want to find more people who maybe view word usage in a more serious tenor.
Or it could be that you follow certain either journals. I know I follow journals or newspapers or news outlets. And actually read the articles. Don't just read the headlines, because you're not going to get a lot of information off of that. But if you're exposed to more professional or regulated language, so to speak, then you can see how it's used in these recognized or these accepted forms in that way. So it might not even, you don't have to like make friends.
Well, no, I mean that's the thing, right? Is like you reinforce your own language by utilizing it. Like, the more frequently you utilize a certain aspect of your language, the more likely it is to kind of sear into your memory of here's how you should properly use it, even if it isn't proper, right? And so if the more you broaden your horizons by, say, following certain journals or understanding that, like, you need to like branch out intellectually in order to find those usages properly used, right? Then that will help you to reinforce those in a greater degree, kind of just mentally.
Right. Is it a matter of just reading? Like, I think most of the problems we run into with words being used incorrectly, at least like switching them, so like then and then, for example, is because you're not seeing it written. Intensive purposes started out that way, but now you see it written a lot. But I wonder if it's that speech versus reading. So if you just need to read more in general, I don't know if that's being a little rude.
I think it helps, though.
Or do you have to read with that in mind? Because, I mean, maybe you read...
You may not notice it if you're not looking for it.
Yeah, like you might not notice how regardless is being used if it's used at all. So, I mean, or how intents and purposes is used if it's used at all. Because not everything you read is going to have these very particular kinds of phrases or words in them.
Yeah, I feel like it goes back to that knowing what's acceptable in what community or in what context, and like what we write for class is a very different thing than what we write for anything else, really.
Yeah.
Even what you write for school is different than what you would write for a job application, is different than you would write for an email to your parents, is different than you would write for, a text message to your best friend or whatever.
Right. So is it, I always think of my emails or things on social media or things that are considered informal. I always treat those still as practice for kind of more formal scenarios. So I'll still proofread, I'll still correct things, as long as I'm not in a super hurry. I'll still go through those informal pieces and edit them for that correctness. So I mean, that's probably just my discourse communities where we prefer everything to be corrected.
I think part of understanding, like, I think we as in the writing center can kind of, I create that same sort of sense of not necessarily urgency, but like emphasis on here's how if I'm using a word incorrectly, making sure I'm using it correctly. But for like the average person, I think it's a matter of divorcing the average person. What am I saying? It's a matter of divorcing those two sets, like putting into spheres like your use of language in a public sphere versus your use of language in an academic sphere or
even a private sphere.
Or even a private sphere, right? And understanding that what you see on a BuzzFeed headline of their use of, say, like epic, like 10 epic things that are whatever, right? Like that may be the colloquial use of the word epic, but like when you're in a literature class,
epic is a totally different thing.
Epic is a totally different thing, right?
Yeah.
And understanding that you can, that there's a way to kind of divorce those things in your head and like turn that switch on and off of like, you can totally use legit with a friend from California, right? Like
and epic,
right? And epic. But once you get into the classroom environment or you're writing a paper for that sort of classroom environment, knowing that like you can still use that language, but not in those settings.
Similar to epic, I had a history professor that went off on somebody who used novel incorrectly. So we were asking about like lengths of things, and she's like, do you want like a novel for our response? And he's like, well, no, a novel is a work of fiction. You are not writing fiction.
That's funny. No, but we use that as slang just to refer to the length of things. Yeah. I think I've sent very long text messages and then apologized for the novel that I just wrote.
That's exactly what I've done.
It's not even novel length, technically. Novel length has their requirements.
It'd be a novella.
Right.
Or a short story.
I didn't
You have a short
even
story, novella, novel, epic.
Right. But an epic has to be a poem, correct?
Yeah.
Oh, does it?
I think epic is, I don't know, I'm not a literature person.
The Odyssey sort of.
The Odyssey counts as an epic. Yeah. Epic is one of those slang terms I use all the time when I was in high school. Like that was a normal part of my speech when I was growing up.
Yeah.
I had to train myself out of things like epic and rad.
Yeah.
Rad. So we're actually at time. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to Reese and Aaron
for
partaking in our episode. And we hope you will join us again at our next episode.